Okay, let's talk for a moment about a poem called Daddy. It's by Silvia Plath. Now, Silvia Plath became over time known as perhaps the leading confessional poet. And that was not even a genre before her in general. All of my students have grown up in a time where it's not uncommon at all to hear people go on television or on YouTube or somewhere and tell you about the difficulties they've had in life, their personal struggles, sometimes very intimate details, and sometimes very salacious or with bombshell reservation, and a lot of things that are sometimes done just for drama now, but were not in public discourse before the 1950s. It was just something people didn't talk about. And you might see in a movie they make fun of a character who's maybe a little older, like the parents of the baby boomers who there's a funny movie where a woman is talking, but every time she says certain words, she lowers her voice as if she's speaking unmentionables. And so she'll be saying, "Oh yes, Cynthia, she was my friend until she got the cancer." And it's done sort of for a joke, but it's kind of pointing out something that was a real neuroses in a kind of way, and that's that speaking of certain things in public is just not something you do. Not if you were raised with any self-respect and proper etiquette in our culture, that sort of thing, right? But television changed this. Oprah is the most famous person, but she wasn't even the first person to start featuring people on her television show that you could call people on the edges or the fringes of society that have stories, and maybe we are aware that those kinds of things happen, but we couldn't put a face to it normally, right? So if you watched Donahue and Oprah and many of these other people who usually had daytime talk shows of a sort, people would come on and they would tell you about their struggles with alcohol or other addiction. They might come on and tell you about how their father incestuously abused them for a period of time, or just almost anything you could imagine that the people of the 40s and 50s could not imagine being spoken about in public, became to some degree the stock in trade. There was a lot of hand-wringing and concern about it because some people thought that this was simply the new version of the freak show, that people were obviously tuning in sometimes because they were going to see something they hadn't seen before. And there probably was definitely an element of that. But another thing that happened is that a lot of things that had been considered so freakish and different were put right in front of people, and they often lost some of the appalling quality. Meaning that, if you actually met two people who were conjoined twins and learned about how they get through their day and what they do and their hopes and dreams, and, how one of them loves to read novels at hours upon end, and the other is kind of bored and gets tired of that because she's stuck to her sister, maybe, right? Some of these didn't seem so strange and amazing and different from the real world, like belonging in a circus tent. They just seemed, to be specifically different in just a different way than all the rest of us were different, that sort of thing, right? So I like to teach the beats and expose my students to the beats because they started in the public discourse some of the talking and to some degree celebrating of characters who were on the fringes of our society. And so they could have been people, for example, with addictions, or they could have been people who felt that their physical gender assignment didn't match the way they felt, for example, right? So I'm glad that my students are growing up in a world where these things aren't as quickly stigmatizing, right? Well, Sylvia Plath's poetry and some others then, especially people who followed her, not her generation in general, right? Uh, Told a lot of intimate details, and it began to be seen as brave, and not for any strange reason. I mean, it was brave in a way if you cared about your social standing, if you cared about not being spoken of in rumors and things like that, right? So getting it out there, sometimes somebody might have said, well, I'm compelled to do this. I don't feel I have much of a choice. I need to tell my story. So we're talking, 80, 90 years after Jung and Freud and others were creating what we now call the talking cure. And over that period of time, an idea had been put forward, and it kept growing. And that's the idea that getting your pain out, getting your story out, getting your fears out, outside of you in words, especially, but especially if you have someone who's uh, can work with you on them, was a way to improve your life, right? So when sometimes people were telling horrific stories or stories with a lot of pain in them, there was an idea that often went along with this, which is this is a good thing. This act itself is good. So you'll meet today people who like poetry, but will tell you, I can't stand confessional poetry because sometimes they got tired of it. Sometimes they just they don't like the vibe, or they don't go to poetry for some of the things that confessional poetry offers. Now, other people find it to be the absolutely most valuable poetry that they've ever read, and they really appreciate people who have written very personal poetry, and they will tell you how much it's helped them and stuff, right? Okay, so Sylvia Plath's name is you can't separate it from that, right? Now, I like teaching Daddy for a couple of reasons. Not because it's actually the most symbolic of all of her poems that they're all like this. They're not. After I read Daddy, you're going to hear how kind of strange it sounds, maybe. Don't think that all of her poems are written this way, right? But I like to show it partially because I think it speaks to something that we've long discussed in literature, and that's the idea of whether the content and the style fit together. The debate's been over many things. So, for example, some people might argue that the content is more important than the style, or the style is more important than the content. But so this poem that I'm going to read to you, I label a vomit, as in it seems to come out so unprocessed and in an unorganized way. It just seems to come out. The pain and the ideas, they are the way we naturally think. One thing leads to another thing through association, which is such a hugely important thing in the way the mind works, right? So, no, what I'm going to say is I'm going to read it, and I'm going to read it in the way I interpret it, which is that it is a blast. At the end of the poem, I don't think you're going to believe what she says in the last couple lines. I never do. And part of the reason is I feel like what is here in the content, the ideas, the metaphors she uses, and what's here in the style, which is this charging forth. Now, one thing she does is she doesn't grab onto a very old-fashioned rhythm and style and rhyme. It's irregular. Now, I say that, but you can hear tons of rhyme inside the poem, right? And the dominant sound is ooh. She's going to reuse that over and over again through the poem. But she doesn't create something that's tamed and controlled, such as, alternating rhyme in a paragraph, in a stanza, or terza rima, or something that takes quite a bit of control. Even arriving at true rhyme often and frequently makes the poem seem something that is controlled. I don't think the emotions in the poem are controlled. I don't think the persona state of mind is very well controlled. So I think it fits in this poem that the style of charging forth and having plenty of rhyme, but not end rhyme, and definitely not, an organized pattern of end rhyme. So let me get started, but see if you think the shape of the poem and the tone of the poem goes with maybe whatever the meaning or message is of the poem, right? Because I think we can easily find poems out there where the poem might be about violence and chaos, and yet it's so well controlled, you have to say, well, the style of that poem doesn't seem to go with the content, right? Okay, so this is Daddy by Silvia Plath. You do not do any more black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or achoo. Daddy, I've had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one gray toe, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic where it pours bean green over blue and the waters off beautiful Nasset. I used to pray to recover you. Ach, du. In the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, but the name of the town is common. My Polak friend says there are a dozen or two, so I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you, the tongue stuck in my jaw. It stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ich, ich. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you, and the language obscene. An engine, chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck and my Tarok pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I've always been scared of you, with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat mustache, and your Aryan eye bright blue. Panzerman, Panzerman, oh you! Not God, but a swastika, so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that, no, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do, but they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They're dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. Okay, can you see why I think at the end, maybe I really don't believe her that much? So when she says, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through, I think we believe in the anger of the speaker of this poem, but not that there's no anger left by the end of it, or that she's able to simply set the anger and the hurt aside and move on. Now, if we go back up, I divided this into chunks so that we can see them in pieces, that because the poem is written in sections, it has some organization. But do you see all the ooh sounds everywhere? Did you hear them when I was reading? That's what I mean by there's obviously a dominant sound or a dominant rhyme, but there isn't a controlling regular metrical pattern to this, right? Now, very big images also. So I often have students ask, well, does she hate him because her daddy was a Nazi? Because he, did these things? No, he wasn't a Nazi. This is a metaphor in a way when she accuses him of being this. Some people, including me, have a problem with this in the poem. Now, I think in the long run, there's a reason for it to be there. But the idea that she wants to borrow the suffering of people who died, people who lost their families, right, because of the victims of the Holocaust, that she's claiming that her life is just as bad as that, or she's matching, her, this is sometimes called a queen for a day concept, like I've suffered more than you, right? Well, it bothered me until I sort of thought about the poem in the sense that this is how we talk when we're really angry. We don't have our regulator on, right? So it's how you hear kids all the time say, I'm going to kill you, right? We don't really believe the kid actually really wants to kill the person. But in their anger, they're just reaching for whatever words and accusations and things they can get to. So that's the way I read the way she does this. But when I say this, I'm being more forgiving than some people are. They really are bothered by the way she pulls in the suffering of Jewish people and others. There's a mention of gypsies, for example, in this when she talks about a woman reading tarot cards, and gypsies were also one of the groups that were targeted specifically by Hitler and the Nazis, right? Okay, so some of this stuff is autobiographical, and she refers to her father, and she refers to him teaching, and we go to San Francisco, which, by the way, people from San Francisco don't like the city to be called Frisco. That's just one of those things outsiders have done, right? If she gets to, or I want to point out at the end of the third stanza here, she says, I used to pray to recover you. Ach du. Okay, that sounds, and I read it as if I'm spitting, right? As if you're generating phlegm and spitting, right? It's a bit like saying, oh, you, it's a bold statement right at the end of it. But then the poem moves on quickly. Listen to this rhythm. In the German tongue, in the Polish town. I think what's starting here are moments where we are going to slip into rhythms. And the dominant sound in these rhythms seems to be a train. right? Now, the train that's referenced here seems to be a train that led people in the Holocaust toward concentration camps and eventually death camps, right? So we have the roller of wars, wars, wars. That's something like a historical commentary on the fact that over time wars have come through. World War II was named World War II because there was already another big one, not too many decades before that. And Europe has seen so many wars over time, right? She mentions, it looks like she's trying to find out who he was, but then somebody tells her, well, the town is common. So she's at a bit of a dead end to know where he comes from. The next stanza says, there are a dozen or two, so I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I don't go in very much to reading a lot of biographical criticism. No, I shouldn't say it that way. The kind of criticism that tries to always find the biographical connection to a line. So I don't know much about her father or exactly her relationship to her father. So when she says, she's searching for where he came from, where he was rooted, I'm not sure that was or was not a real big idea inside of her mind. Certainly it might have been, and you can research this. I am much more committed to the idea that the poem or the story or whatever we're looking at is a piece of art that is more or less separate from the artist. So I like to see what's actually there, right? And what we see still is anger, and we see some mystery. And it's almost like, when you say something like, how could you have come from me, or how could you be my father, or something, right? She's thinking to some degree in those lines, right? Now we get back here to, we had wars, 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 and now we're going to get ich, 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 ich. And to me, that sounds again like a train that is starting to turn over its wheels. And they do start very slow and then they get faster. Now, ich also means I. So think about a person who says, I could not say I. It's a kind of thing of, I don't have an identity. I don't know how to express my identity. I don't know who I am. So how could I speak of myself, right? But I think that's a very powerful kind of line she has there. And it brings us back to that rhythm again. And it's also it's a reference to the unspoken or the unspeakable, what can't be spoken. And there's a sadness in the idea that if a person can't look at themselves, can't stand themselves, eventually tries to kill themselves, where does that come from? This sometimes incredibly potent disfamiliarity or discomfort with even thinking about who the I is, right? Or thinking about who I am. Okay, so she says, I could hardly speak German, and he's not so specifically related to Germans in World War II, but there is an ethnic connection, right? But she's now bringing in language, that the language itself was actually difficult to talk with, right? So she says, an engine, chuffing me off like a Jew. And I think we have some of those rhythms again, and like of the train, right? And by the way, she's not Jewish. So the way she's bringing this in has also bothered some readers of that whatever she went through with her father, which we don't have a lot of evidence, was especially horrible and terrible, in comparison, for example, to the murders of the Jewish people by the Germans. Some people really wonder about her grabbing association in this way, right? Okay, now the snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. Immediately, people who've read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland might start to flash to references in there, to speaking of snow. And there's the passage early in The Wasteland where the woman who seems to be of the bourgeoisie is speaking about some of what they went through, which weren't really, at least not in her references, weren't specifically physically in danger. And that doesn't mean she's not traumatized by the war, but she's talking about sledding on the snow and not, shells falling around her, right? Then the next line, with my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck. Now, ancestress refers to the idea that she might come from somebody like this, but the poem says no more about it. But when it brings in the tarot pack, that very much, I think, reminds us of T.S. Eliot and Madame Sosostris, who's a character who reads the tarot cards in Eliot's The Wasteland. Now, she pulls down farther, and she talks about being afraid of her father, and again, connecting him to Nazis and Panzer as a tank, and very violent World War II imagery, right? And then she's going to eventually also connect him to being a vampire, right? But after she talks about trying to commit suicide and labeling her father, she says, cleft in your chin instead of your foot, is a reference to the idea that the devil is often portrayed as having a cloven foot, which means a cleft is in the middle of it. It's a split foot, right? And she's mentioning that her father has something like a cleft in his chin, but she's definitely comparing him to the devil, right? Then Bit My Pretty Red Heart in two, and we're going to get to the vampire images, and she's going to talk about trying to commit suicide, and then eventually connecting to another man because her own father has died, and it's like she's angry at him for not being around, so she can attack him in this way. And then she brings in the man who became her husband after this, right? If it goes, let's see, if we go all the way to the end, when we have the vampire, that the two of them both are vampires and they're so horrible. And that's going to help her close the poem out where she says, there's a stake in your fat black heart. Because when we think of the stories of Dracula and some other vampire stories like Nosferatu, we think about Central Europe, maybe Eastern Europe, and we think about the monster being recognized, outside of town or in the graveyard or somewhere where the villagers then draw together what weapons they have, and then they go and attack. And the only way to finish the vampire, of course, is to drive the wooden stake through. And so she's using this very violent mythic imagery to talk about her father and the idea that he's got a stake in his heart, basically, so she's through. But like I said, if we think of the psychological realism that is in here, the pain, the suffering, everything, then at the end when she says, I'm through, I think it almost feels more, well, it definitely almost feels more to me like I'm through as I'm through with words right now. I don't really believe she's through with the anger and the trauma and everything else, right? So I hope you find this poem really interesting. It speaks to a lot of people because there's a certain kind of general rule in writing, especially songwriting and poetry, and that's that the more specific you get, the more universal it sometimes applies, meaning that you can say exactly what your clock radio looked like that woke you up for high school, and maybe no poet or no reader will ever read your poem and have a clock just like yours, but they absolutely get it because they had some sort of clock, that woke them up every morning, even when they're exhausted, when they had to go to school. So her getting specific about things she hated again about her father and the other man and the frustrations, even the frustrations of not being able to end her own life. A lot of people read this and connect to it, and it becomes a very important poem to them. Now, I said, I don't want you to think that all of her poems are just like this one. They're not. And she's got some very tender and beautiful poems. Some people love the poem she wrote about the day after having a baby and laying there in the hospital with the baby right by you. One of her poems is very sensual. It's a poem called Blackberrying, and those are two that you might look up if you want to. But Silvia Plath, she also is powerful and clear, and some people appreciate that. It's easier to get to her metaphors than it is to some other people. Elizabeth Bishop, for example, who's considered a great poet, is, I think, harder to parse and to see as many things that she might be working with. Silvia Plath is straightforward in some ways that others aren't. So I hope you like this one.